The year was 1972, a time when the world felt like it was changing fast, but in the small town where Arthur lived, time seemed to move a little slower. The air was thick with the smell of fresh cut grass and gasoline, and the sounds of the neighborhood were the familiar hum of lawn mowers and the distant chiming of the ice cream truck. Arthur was 23 years old, sitting at a small drafting table in the corner of his cramped apartment. He was hunched over a large sheet of paper, his hand moving with a precision that surprised most people who knew him. He was drawing a house. Not just any house, but a home that he had designed himself, filled with intricate details and angles that most people wouldn't notice unless they looked closely. Arthur had a gift. He could look at an empty plot of land and see structure and beauty where others saw just dirt and grass. He was ambitious, filled with a fire that pushed him to want more than the quiet life his parents had lived. He wanted to build things that touched the sky. He wanted his name to be known. But right then, his life was simple. He had a job at a local construction firm, a beat-up old car that barely started in the mornings, and Clara. Clara was the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. She was soft-spoken, with a gentle laugh that could make Arthur forget about a bad day in an instant. She didn't care about skyscrapers or big cities. She loved her garden, she loved Sunday mornings with pancakes, and she loved Arthur. In her eyes, he was already a success, long before the rest of the world knew his name. They had grown up together, walking the same streets to school, and by the time they were 23, everyone just assumed they would get married. It was the natural order of things. But the natural order wasn't enough for Arthur. Not anymore. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of a week that felt like any other. The mailman dropped a thick envelope through the slot in Arthur's door. It was from a massive architectural firm in the city, a place he had sent his portfolio to on a whim months ago. He didn't think they would even look at it. When he tore open the envelope and read the letter, his hands started to shake. It was a job offer. Not just a job, but a career-making opportunity. They wanted him to start immediately. They offered a salary that was triple what he was making now. They talked about big projects, designing glass towers that would scrape the clouds. That evening, Arthur sat across from Clara at their favorite diner. The red vinyl seats were sticky, and the waitress poured coffee with a tired expression. Arthur's heart was pounding in his chest. He pushed the letter across the table toward her, a wide grin on his face, waiting for her to share his excitement. He expected her to jump up and down, to tell him how proud she was. Clara picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the words slowly. When she looked back up at him, the expression on her face wasn't joy. It was fear. "The city?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arthur, that's 5 hours away." "It's not that far," Arthur said quickly, brushing off her concern. "I can come back on weekends. Or we can move there later, once I get settled." "Think about it, Clara. This is it. This is everything I've ever wanted. We won't have to worry about money. We can buy a real house. You can have anything you want." Clara put the letter down on the table and folded her hands in her lap. She looked out the window at the quiet street they had known their whole lives. "I don't care about money, Arthur. I care about us. I care about building a life here, where our families are. You're talking about chasing a dream, but what if the dream is right here in front of you?" Arthur felt a flash of irritation. He loved Clara, but he felt like she was trying to clip his wings. She didn't understand the pressure he felt to be something more. She didn't understand that being a big fish in a small pond wasn't enough for him. In his mind, he was doing this for them. He was sacrificing his comfort to give them a better future. He couldn't see that Clara didn't view their life as a sacrifice. "Please," Arthur said, his voice hardening slightly. "Don't make this harder than it is. It's a chance. One chance. If I say no, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The silence between them stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Clara looked at him with eyes that were starting to shine with tears, but she didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. She knew that once Arthur set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. She knew that he was choosing a path, and she had to decide if she could walk it with him. 2 weeks later, the summer heat was at its peak. The day Arthur left, the sun was blindingly bright. He had packed his entire life into a few cardboard boxes and the back seat of his car. Clara stood on the sidewalk, clutching a sweater even though it was hot. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself, like she was holding herself together. Arthur checked the tires, checked the gas, checked the map. He was busy with everything except looking at her. He felt a strange knot in his stomach, a feeling that maybe he was making a mistake, but he pushed it down. He told himself that successful men had to make hard choices. He told himself that this was just the beginning. He got into the driver's seat and rolled down the window. "I'll call you when I get there," he said. Clara leaned down, resting her arms on the doorframe. She looked at him for a long time, studying his face like she was trying to memorize it. "Be careful, Arthur," she said softly. "Don't forget who you are when you're up there in the clouds." "I won't," he said. "I promise." He started the engine. The car rumbled to life, vibrating against his seat. He put it in gear and pulled away from the curb. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the horizon that seemed to stretch out forever. He watched the town disappear, the familiar houses turning to trees, then to open highway. He turned up the radio, letting the music drown out the quiet voice in his head that was telling him to turn around. As the miles ticked by, the knot in his stomach loosened, replaced by the thrill of the speed. He was moving towards something big. He was leaving the smallness behind. He didn't know it then, but as the dust of his hometown settled behind him, he was leaving behind the best part of himself. He was trading a life of love and connection for a life of ambition and solitude. He thought he was driving toward his future, but in many ways, he was driving away from the only happiness he would ever truly know. The engine roared, the highway stretched out like a gray ribbon, and Arthur Thorne drove on, blind to the cost of the dream he was chasing. 17 years had a way of slipping by faster than anyone expected. In the blink of an eye, the young man with the beat-up car and the drafting table had become someone else entirely. Arthur was now 40 years old, and he had won the game he set out to play. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, 30 floors above the busy streets of the city. The wind up there was cold, cutting through the fabric of his expensive Italian suit, but he barely felt it. Below him, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, looking like a sprawling circuit board of gold and diamonds. Arthur had everything he thought he wanted. He was a name partner at the firm. His signature was on the blueprints of some of the tallest buildings in the skyline. He drove a car that cost more than his parents' house. He had a closet full of watches that could tell time in 5 different time zones, as if he needed to know what hour it was in Tokyo or London while he sat alone in his living room. Inside, the apartment was stunning. It was filled with sleek, modern furniture, black leather, glass, and chrome. It was the kind of place they featured in magazines. But it was also quiet. The kind of quiet that echoed. There were no toys on the floor, no muddy shoes by the door, and no smell of a roast cooking in the oven. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic far below. That morning, a letter had arrived. It wasn't a bill or a business contract. It was a simple envelope with a handwritten address. Arthur recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Clara S. He opened it with hands that felt surprisingly clumsy. Inside was an invitation. Cream-colored paper with elegant gold lettering. It was a wedding invitation. Clara was getting married. Arthur stared at the date. It was 3 weeks away. He felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. For 17 years, he had kept a mental picture of Clara in his head, frozen at 23, standing on the sidewalk while he drove away. He had told himself that she was waiting, that she understood his drive, that one day he would come back and sweep her off her feet with his success. He realized now how arrogant that was. People don't stop living just because you leave. Clara had lived a whole life without him. Arthur decided he had to go. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to close that chapter, or maybe he just needed to prove to himself that he had made the right choice. He rented a car for the drive back to his hometown. He didn't take his luxury sports car, it felt too flashy for the quiet streets he used to know. As he drove out of the city, the towering buildings gave way to suburbs, and the suburbs gave way to open fields and trees. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. The world felt smaller here, slower. He arrived at the old stone church where they had both gone to Sunday school as kids. It looked exactly the same, which felt strange because Arthur felt so different. He parked down the street and watched the guests arrive. He saw people he recognized, neighbors, old teachers, friends he hadn't spoken to in decades. They were older now, grayer, heavier. They walked with a relaxed pace, greeting each other with warm hugs and loud laughter. Arthur checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked successful. He looked powerful. But he felt like an intruder. He buttoned his jacket and walked toward the church. He slipped into a back pew just before the music started. The organ filled the small sanctuary, a sound that vibrated in his chest. Then, the doors at the front opened, and Clara walked in. She was wearing a simple dress, not a big white gown, because this wasn't her first marriage. She looked beautiful, but not in the polished, magazine cover way Arthur was used to seeing women in the city. She looked real. She looked like she had smiled a lot over the last 17 years. There were crinkles at the corners of her eyes, and her hair was a different color, but the warmth in her face was exactly the same. Arthur watched her stand next to a man he had never met. The man was tall, with kind eyes and rough hands. He wasn't wearing a designer suit, just a clean, pressed shirt and slacks. He looked at Clara with a look of pure, unguarded adoration. He didn't look at her like she was a trophy, he looked at her like she was the only safe place in the world. As they said their vows, Arthur felt a physical pain in his stomach. He listened to them promise to love each other, to care for each other in sickness and in health. He thought about his own life. He thought about the contracts he signed, the deals he closed, the money in the bank. He had never made a promise like that to anyone. He had never trusted anyone enough to let them see him when he was weak or sick. When the ceremony ended, the guests poured out into the churchyard for the reception. Arthur stood in the shadows of an old oak tree, holding a glass of punch he didn't want. He watched Clara and her husband laugh as they greeted their friends. They looked complete. Clara spotted him. She excused herself and walked over. For a second, Arthur panicked. He didn't know what to say. But she just smiled, that gentle smile of hers. "Arthur," she said. "I'm so glad you came." "You look beautiful, Clara," Arthur said, and his voice cracked just a little. "I'm happy for you." "Thank you," she said, looking over at her husband. "This is Thomas. He teaches at the elementary school. He loves woodworking." Arthur shook Thomas's hand when he came over. Thomas had a firm grip and calluses on his palms. "Clara told me a lot about you," Thomas said, and there was no jealousy in his voice, just genuine friendliness. "You're the famous architect." "I try," Arthur said, feeling the words turn to ash in his mouth. They talked for a few minutes. Simple small talk. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about why Arthur left or how much things had changed. But as he stood there, Arthur realized the gap between them wasn't about miles or money. It was about choices. Clara had chosen a life of connection. She had built a web of relationships, family, friends, neighbors that supported her. Arthur had built a tower, and he was standing alone at the top of it. "I should get going," Arthur said abruptly. He couldn't breathe. The happiness in the air was too thick, it was choking him. "Okay," Clara said, stepping forward to give him a quick hug. It was a brief hug, polite, friendly. It wasn't a hug that said "I love you." It was a hug that said goodbye. "Take care of yourself, Arthur." "You too," he said. He walked back to his car without looking back. He drove away from the town, watching the rearview mirror until the church steeple disappeared. When he got back to the city that night, the lights didn't look like diamonds anymore. They just looked like lights. He walked into his cold, beautiful apartment and poured himself a drink. He stood on the balcony again, looking out at the empire he had built. He had conquered the city. He had the money. He had the status. But for the first time, he realized that he had lost. He remembered what Clara had said to him all those years ago, "Don't forget who you are when you're up there in the clouds." He took a sip of his drink and realized he didn't know who he was anymore. He was just the man in the suit. Over the next few months, Arthur tried to ignore the feeling. He threw himself into his work harder than ever. He designed bigger, taller, more expensive buildings. He ignored the headaches that started to plague him in the afternoons. He ignored the way his chest felt tight after running for a cab. He surrounded himself with people who worked for him, people who nodded at his ideas and laughed at his jokes. He didn't want to be around real people anymore. Real people asked too many questions. Real people made you feel things. He started to see his life as a series of transactions. You trade time for money. You trade sleep for success. But looking at Clara's wedding invitation, which he had kept tucked in a drawer, he realized the math was wrong. He had traded everything of value for things that didn't matter. And the worst part was, he didn't know how to stop the train he was on. The years seemed to speed up as Arthur moved through his 40s and into his 50s. The days blurred together in a continuous stream of blueprints, meetings, and flight schedules. By the time Arthur turned 55, he had done the impossible. He had designed a building that would change the skyline of the city forever. They called it the Apex. It was a twisting, glass tower that seemed to defy gravity, a needle made of steel and light that pierced the clouds. It was the kind of building that tourists would buy postcards of. It was the kind of building that would be in history books. The opening night was a black tie gala. The city's elite were there, politicians, celebrities, and business tycoons. The lights of the cameras flashed so bright and so often that Arthur saw spots in his eyes for hours. He stood on a stage, holding a giant pair of golden scissors. The mayor handed him a heavy crystal plaque, and the crowd erupted in applause. They cheered for him. They toasted his vision. They called him a genius. Arthur smiled for the cameras, shaking hands and thanking people, but inside, he felt absolutely nothing. He looked out at the sea of faces and realized he didn't see a single friend. He saw investors, he saw rivals, and he saw people who wanted something from him. The moment the speeches were over and the band started playing, Arthur slipped away. He walked out of the ballroom, leaving his champagne glass on a high table. He took the private elevator all the way to the top floor of his new tower. He stood on the edge of the roof, looking down at the city he had conquered. The wind was howling up there, freezing cold and loud. He was on top of the world, literally. He had achieved every goal he had set when he was that young man in the drafting table. He had money. He had fame. He had power. But standing there alone in the dark, shivering in his tuxedo, the victory felt incredibly hollow. It felt like winning a game that no one else was playing. 2 days later, the bubble burst. Arthur was in his office, reviewing some minor structural details, when his secretary knocked on the door. She looked nervous. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "There's a call for you." It's your brother." Arthur picked up the phone, his mind already on a budget report. "This is Arthur," he said curtly. "Arthur," his brother's voice came through the line, sounding heavy and tired. "It's Dad. He passed away this morning." It was peaceful, in his sleep, but he's gone. Arthur froze. The pen in his hand hovered over the paper, a drop of ink spreading into a dark stain. His father was gone. A sudden, sharp pain hit Arthur in the chest, followed by a wave of nausea. He hadn't seen his father in over 2 years. He had always planned to visit, but something always came up: a project deadline, a business trip, a merger negotiation. There was always a next time. Now, there wasn't. Arthur drove home that weekend, not in a limousine, but in a rented sedan, the same way he had for Clara's wedding. The drive felt longer this time. The town looked smaller, older. When he arrived at the family home, it was surrounded by cars. He walked in the front door and was immediately hit by the smell of old furniture and the heavy, thick scent of flowers brought for the funeral. He saw his siblings in the living room. They looked older, lined with the stresses of normal lives: mortgages, repairs, raising children. They greeted him with polite nods, but the air was awkward. They didn't know him anymore. He was the rich brother who flew in for the important events but missed everything else. Then came the hardest part. Arthur walked into the kitchen and saw a group of young people he didn't recognize. They were his nieces and nephews, grown up now or nearly grown. They were laughing and eating sandwiches, looking at phones. One of them, a teenage boy, looked up at Arthur. "Are you Uncle Arthur?" the boy asked, with genuine curiosity but zero familiarity. Arthur looked at this young man, his own flesh and blood, and realized the boy didn't know him. He knew Arthur was an architect. He knew Arthur had a famous building. But he didn't know what Arthur's favorite color was, or what kind of music he liked, or the sound of his laugh. To them, Arthur was just a picture in a frame or a name mentioned occasionally at dinner. He was a stranger. At the funeral service the next day, the church was full. People told stories about Arthur's father. They talked about how he helped fix a neighbor's roof, how he coached the local baseball team, how he never missed a Sunday dinner. They talked about a life of connection, of small acts of kindness that added up to a legacy of love. Arthur sat in the front pew, listening to these stories, and felt a deep, burning shame. He looked at the wooden coffin. His father was a good man. He was a simple man. And Arthur had been too busy to learn from him. While the graveside service was happening, Arthur's cell phone began to vibrate in his pocket. It was a rude, buzzing noise against the solemn silence. He ignored it. It vibrated again. And again. He knew exactly who it was. It was his office. It was probably a junior partner asking about a permit for the next project. They didn't care that he was burying his father. To them, the most important thing in the world was the concrete schedule. They viewed his grief as an inconvenience to the company timeline. Arthur excused himself and walked away from the grave, toward the line of trees at the edge of the cemetery. He answered the phone, his jaw clenched tight. "This better be an emergency," he whispered. "Arthur, we need to sign off on the steel order by 5 o'clock today or the price goes up," the voice on the other end said, rushed and impatient. "Where are you?" The contrast hit Arthur like a physical blow. On one side of the phone call was millions of dollars and steel and glass. On the other side was his father's grave. "I am at my father's funeral," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "Do not call me again." He hung up and turned the phone off. He stood there under the bare branches of the oak tree, looking back at the crowd of mourners. He saw his siblings comforting one another. He saw Clara and her husband, Thomas, standing respectfully at the back. They had come to pay their respects, even though he had been absent from their lives. Thomas had his arm around Clara, supporting her. Arthur watched them for a long time. They were holding onto each other. Who was holding onto Arthur? No one. He returned to his father's empty house after the service. The family was clearing things out, deciding who would take what. Arthur sat in his father's old armchair. It was worn out, the fabric frayed on the armrests. He picked up a small coaster on the side table. It was a piece of cheap plastic, something Arthur had made in woodshop in high school. His father had kept it all these years. He had used it every single day. Arthur held that cheap piece of plastic in his hand and finally understood. He had spent 30 years building monuments to himself, skyscrapers made of concrete and steel that were supposed to last forever. He thought those buildings were his legacy. But sitting in that quiet, dusty room, holding a coaster, he realized his father's legacy was the love he left in the hearts of the people in that cemetery. Arthur's legacy was just a cold building that people walked through without knowing his name. He had traded his humanity for his career. He had traded Sunday dinners for board meetings. He had traded real, messy, human connection for the illusion of success. He drove back to the city the next morning, leaving the town behind him again. But this time, he didn't feel the thrill of speed. He didn't feel like he was going back to conquer something. He felt like he was going back to a prison of his own making. He arrived at his luxury penthouse, the one with the view of the apex tower. He poured a drink and sat in the dark. The city lights twinkled below him, mocking him. He was 55 years old. He had everything he ever wanted. And he had never been more alone in his entire life. The silence of the apartment wasn't peaceful anymore. It was screaming at him. Time has a way of moving differently when you get older. When Arthur was young, a year felt like a long journey. Now, at 68, the years were starting to blur together, flying by like mile markers on a highway. The ambitious young man who wanted to touch the sky was now a man with white hair and a slower step. He was still the head of the firm, a respected figure in the city, but the fire inside him had changed. It wasn't a fire of ambition anymore, it was a quiet, cold anxiety. He spent his days protecting what he had built, worrying about stock prices and market trends, terrified that someone would come along and take it all away. He was in his office late one Tuesday evening. The cleaning crew was vacuuming in the hallway, and the sun had long since set. Arthur was rubbing his left arm. It had been bothering him for weeks, a strange ache that wouldn't go away. He told himself it was just stress, or maybe he had slept wrong. He was Arthur Thorne, after all. He was invincible. He had survived 50 years of high-pressure deals, a little pain wasn't going to stop him. Suddenly, the pain changed. It wasn't just an ache anymore. It felt like an elephant was sitting on his chest. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and his vision blurred. He tried to stand up to get some water, but his legs felt like lead weights. He fell back into his leather chair, gasping for breath. The room started to spin. He reached for the phone on his desk, but his hand was shaking so badly he knocked it onto the floor. The sound of the phone hitting the carpet was the last thing he remembered before everything went black. Arthur woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a machine. The light was harsh and white. He tried to move, but there were tubes in his arms and sticky pads on his chest. A nurse in blue scrubs bustled into the room, checking a monitor. "You're awake," she said cheerfully. "You gave us quite a scare, Mr. Thorne. You had a heart attack. You're in the ICU." He spent a week in that hospital. It was the longest week of his life. For the first few days, he drifted in and out of sleep, fighting the pain in his chest and the fog in his brain. But as he got stronger, the silence of the room became deafening. He lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting. In the movies, when a powerful man gets sick, the waiting room is full. People are pacing, flowers are stacked high, and secretaries are bustling in and out. Arthur expected that. He deserved that. But his room was empty. There were no flowers. There were no cards. On the fourth day, his phone sat on the bedside table. It beeped with emails and notifications. He looked at the screen. They were messages from his junior partners. "Did you sign the merger papers? The client is asking about the timeline. When can you come back?" Not one person asked, "Are you okay?" Not one person asked, "How do you feel?" They didn't care about Arthur the human being, they only cared about Arthur the signature. He realized then that if he died in that bed, the firm would issue a press release within an hour, and they would have a new partner in his chair by the end of the week. The world would keep turning. The buildings would stay standing. His absence would be nothing more than a line item in a financial report. When he was finally discharged, Arthur didn't go back to the office. He went home. He walked into his penthouse, the same place he had lived in for decades, and for the first time, he hated it. It was cold, sterile, and utterly silent. The expensive furniture looked like props in a museum. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He spent the next few months recovering slowly. He hired a real estate agent and put the penthouse on the market. He began selling things. The art collection, the sports car, the watches. He didn't need them. They were just heavy anchors dragging him down. He felt a strange sense of lightness every time a truck pulled up to take something away. He moved into a smaller, quieter apartment near the park. It was simple. It had books, a comfortable chair, and a window that let in the sun. But getting rid of things wasn't enough. He needed to fix the past. Or at least, he needed to try. He thought about Clara constantly. He remembered her face at her wedding, the way she looked at Thomas. He wondered if she was happy. He wondered if she ever thought about him. One afternoon, Arthur got into his car and drove back to his hometown. It felt different now. He wasn't driving there to show off his success. He was driving there to confess his failure. He found Clara's house. It was a small cottage with a garden that overflowed with flowers. Thomas's truck was in the driveway. Arthur sat in the car for a long time, his heart pounding harder than it had when he was in the hospital. He was terrified. He was the great Arthur Thorne, a man who had faced angry boards of directors and lawsuits, but he was terrified to knock on this door. He finally got out and walked up the path. Clara answered the door. She looked older now, her hair silver, her face softer. But when she saw him, her eyes didn't light up. They just looked tired. She invited him in, offering him tea with the same polite manners she had always had. They sat at the kitchen table. Arthur looked around. The room was full of life. There were photos of children and grandchildren on the fridge. There were drawings and finger paintings taped to the cabinets. It was messy and chaotic and beautiful. "I had a heart attack," Arthur said suddenly, blurting it out before he lost his nerve. Clara stopped pouring the tea. She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that, Arthur. Are you all right now?" "I am," he said. "But it made me think. It made me think about a lot of things. I realized I made a mistake. A big one. I walked away from the best thing I ever had. I chose concrete and steel over people. And I have nobody, Clara, I have nobody to call if I get sick. I have nobody to care if I die." He reached out and took her hand. His hands were old and shaking. "I wasted my life. I have all this money, and I have no one to share it with. I was hoping. I don't know what I was hoping. Maybe that we could start over. Maybe that you could forgive me." Clara gently pulled her hand away. She didn't do it angrily, but she did it firmly. She looked him in the eyes, and her gaze was sad but clear. "Arthur," she said softly. "I appreciate you telling me this. And I forgive you for leaving. I forgave you for that a long time ago. But look at me. Look at my life. I have grandchildren. I have a husband I love. I have a community. My life is full. You can't just walk back in after 50 years and expect to pick up where we left off. We aren't those people anymore. I'm not 23, and neither are you." She stood up and walked over to the fridge, pointing to a picture of a smiling little girl. "This is my granddaughter, Lily. She is learning to ride a bike. That is what matters to me now. That is my life. You can't be part of it just because you're lonely now. You made your choices, Arthur. You have to live with them." Arthur sat there for a moment, letting her words sink in. They weren't cruel words. They were true words. And that hurt more. He realized that the door wasn't locked, but it was closed. There was no place for him in this warm, messy room. He was a tourist looking into a window at a life he could have had. "I understand," Arthur said quietly. He stood up. "You have a beautiful family, Clara. You were right. About everything. You were right." She walked him to the door. "Take care of yourself, Arthur," she said one last time. He walked back to the car, the weight of his regret settling onto his shoulders. He got in and started the engine. He didn't cry. He just felt an immense, aching emptiness. He drove away from the house, watching the flowers disappear in the rearview mirror. He knew now that no amount of money, no success, could buy him a ticket back to the past. He had 50 years of memories, and most of them were just of him walking alone. 5 years had passed since the day Arthur stood in Clara's kitchen and finally heard the truth he had been running from for decades. He was 73 now. His hair was thin and snowy white, and his face was etched with deep lines that mapped out a life of hard work and harder lessons. He didn't live in a penthouse anymore. He didn't live in a glass tower. He lived in a small, one-story cottage on the edge of the same town he grew up in. It was a modest house, with a creaky wooden porch and a backyard that needed mowing. Arthur had spent the last few years giving things away. He had donated his vast fortune to charity, set up trust funds for his nieces and nephews, the children of strangers he used to be related to, and kept only enough to live comfortably. He didn't need the money anymore. He knew now that money was just a tool to buy things, and things couldn't keep you warm at night. On this particular Tuesday, the sun was bright, and the air had that crisp smell of autumn that hints at the coming winter. Arthur put on his favorite old coat, the one with the patched elbow, and grabbed his walking cane. He walked slowly down the sidewalk toward the city park. This was his routine now. Every morning, he would go to the park, sit on his favorite bench, and watch the world go by. He used to think that slowing down was for people who had given up. He used to think that if you weren't racing toward a goal, you were dying. Now, he knew the truth. Racing was dying. Walking was living. When you walked, you noticed things. You noticed the way the light hit the red and orange leaves on the trees. You noticed the sound of the wind through the branches. You noticed the people. Arthur sat down on his bench with a soft groan. His knees ached a little, a constant reminder of the body that had carried him through 73 years of ups and downs. He watched a mother pushing a stroller, listening to her coo at the baby. He watched an old man throwing a ball to a dog that never got tired. These were the moments he had missed. He had missed them because he was looking at the sky, dreaming of buildings, while the real life was happening right here on the ground. After about an hour, Arthur noticed two people walking down the path toward him. It was a young couple, maybe 22 or 23 years old. They were holding hands, but their body language was tense. They stopped near the water fountain, just a few feet away from Arthur's bench. "I'm telling you, it's the chance of a lifetime," the young man said. He was dressed in a sharp suit, holding a briefcase, looking very much like Arthur did at that age. "The firm is in the big city. If I take this job, I'm a partner in 5 years. We're set, Jessica. We're set for life." The young woman, Jessica, pulled her hand away. She was crying softly, wiping her eyes with a sleeve. "But what about us? You said we'd get an apartment here. You said we'd save for a house. If you go, you're working 80 hours a week. When will I see you? When will we have a life?" Arthur froze. His heart skipped a beat. It was like listening to a recording of his own past. The words were identical. The desperation in the boy's voice, the ambition blinding him to the pain he was causing, it was all the same. The boy continued, "I'm doing this for us, Jess. Don't you see I'm building a future so we don't have to struggle? You're being selfish. You don't believe in me." "I believe in you," she whispered. "I just don't want to lose you to a job that doesn't care if you exist." Arthur felt a strong urge to stand up and grab the boy by the shoulders. He wanted to shake him. He wanted to scream, "Look at me. Look at what happens when you win. You win nothing." He wanted to tell him that the future he was building was a ghost. The money would come, but the girl would be gone. The girl would marry a teacher or a carpenter who was home for dinner, and she would be happy. And this boy would be sitting on a bench 40 years from now, alone, wishing he could go back to this exact second. But Arthur didn't scream. He didn't grab the boy. He just sat there, watching. He realized that this was the test of his life. He couldn't force them to understand. Wisdom isn't something you can give to people, it's something they have to steal for themselves, usually by making the same mistakes everyone else made. However, he couldn't just sit there and stay silent. Not this time. He slowly stood up, his joints cracking. He walked over to the water fountain. The young couple stopped talking and looked at him, startled. They probably saw just a frail old man, harmless but in the way. "The water's cold today," Arthur said gently, nodding at the fountain. He looked at the young man. The boy looked annoyed, impatient to get back to his argument. "We're actually having a private conversation, sir," the boy said politely but coldly. "I know," Arthur said. "I couldn't help but overhear. You're going to the city. For the firm. The big opportunity." The boy straightened his tie, puffing out his chest slightly. "Yes, sir. I am." Arthur looked at Jessica, then back at the boy. His eyes were clear, blue, and filled with a sadness that made the boy stop talking. "I made that choice," Arthur said softly. 50 years ago. I stood on a corner just like this, and I told the woman I loved that I had to go. I told her I was doing it for us. I told her she was holding me back if she didn't see that." He took a slow breath. "I went. I built the buildings. I made the money. I became exactly who I wanted to be. And you know what? The city didn't care. The firm didn't care. And she waited for 3 years. Then she stopped waiting. She married a man who loved her more than he loved his career." The young man looked down at his shoes, his face flushing. Jessica stopped crying and looked at Arthur with wide eyes. "I'm 73 years old now," Arthur continued, his voice trembling just a little. "I have more money than I can spend. But I eat breakfast alone. I go to the doctor alone. I sit on this bench alone. You think you are building a future, son. You aren't. You're just spending the only currency that matters, time, on something that won't love you back." He reached out and touched the boy's shoulder lightly. "The job will be there next year. Or there will be another job. But this girl, if you walk away, she won't be there. And 50 years from now, when you're sitting on a bench, that will be the only thing you remember about this day. Not the success. The silence." Arthur didn't wait for a reply. He didn't want thanks or apologies. He just nodded at them, wished them a good day, and turned around. He walked away, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. He didn't look back to see if they hugged or if they argued. He had said his piece. It was up to them now. He walked home slowly, the autumn wind rustling the dried leaves around his feet. He felt lighter than he had in years. He realized that he couldn't fix his own past. He couldn't undo the mistakes he made. The empty chair in his living room would remain empty. But maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else keep their chair from being empty. When he got back to his cottage, he made himself a pot of tea. He sat in his old armchair by the window and watched the sun begin to set. The sky turned a brilliant shade of purple and orange, a sight more beautiful than any skyscraper he had ever designed. He thought about Clara, hoping she was happy, hoping she was safe. He looked around his small living room. It was quiet, but it wasn't a lonely quiet anymore. It was a peaceful quiet. He saw things clearly now. He saw that life wasn't about the big moments, the promotions, or the awards. Life was about the quiet moments in between. It was about holding hands, about sharing a meal, about being there. Arthur Thorne closed his eyes and took a sip of his tea. He was 73. He had wasted his life chasing a ghost. But in this final moment, sitting in the fading light, he finally understood. He was just a man. And being just a man, with nothing left to prove, was enough. He hoped the boy in the park would understand that sooner than he did. He hoped the boy wouldn't waste his 50 years.